Greetings and salutations, everyone. We're in the middle of some really surreal times at the moment. Hope everyone's trying to stay sane in their isolation. So this is a good time, I guess, to bring you another video. What better way to keep occupied than freshening up with some ReasonML? So let's continue on from the previous episodes. You'll want to have completed episode 4 where we set up AWS Amplify Auth and we used ReasonML to set up the user context. We're going to take the logged in user and we're going to associate that with an author object in our AppSync GraphQL service. So we're going to do another Reason Apollo hooks mutation query. And we're going to save those user details against the user context. And we're also going to create a page, a section of the site that only a valid author will have access to. So this is then going to lead into our next video where we'll take those author details and enable them to actually do a GraphQL mutation to create a new post. So I hope you enjoy this video. Let's go smash some code.
Okay, so next we're going to update our user types to be able to store the logged in user details. So we're going to define a type here. And that we'll just keep the email, which will be a string, and the ID, also a string. We're going to update our authenticated variant to accept the user details, and the user logged in to do the same. We're now going to update our sign-in modal. So we're going to put our handle state change method here. A handle change method is going to accept the auth state and the auth data, which is returned from our AWS Amplify authentication that we set up in episode 4. And we're also going to pass in the user context action that we want to dispatch. I'm going to remove this handle state change from here because for some reason it's not going to like referring to its own dispatch, and it's just going to keep looping and create an error. Now we then need to update the handle state changes here to actually pass in the auth data. We need to update the sign-in button. So this is now expecting user details, but we're not actually using it in this section. We're just displaying a sign-in or sign-out button, depending on whether the user's logged in or not. So I'm just going to put that there so the Reason compiler doesn't throw an error. There's another section where we need to do the same thing. Page. So the first thing we want to do is update our GraphQL schema to associate a user ID with an author. This way, when you log in, we can take the AWS Cognito user auth ID and run a GraphQL query to retrieve the author details associated with that user ID. Then we can push that change to persist it in the AppSync GraphQL service. And if everything goes well, you should see the GraphQL endpoint and API key right at the end. So we need to then update the GraphQL schema.json. This is what the GraphQL PPX looks for when you're writing any GraphQL mutations or queries. Open up your AWS console. Open up your schema file, click to export to schema.json. Then we're just going to copy that, select all, copy, and paste into your GraphQL schema.json. We should be able to run this and nothing should be broken, hopefully. Looks like everything's there. So we've only implemented the default AWS Amplify sign-in method. So we haven't actually set up anything at this stage to create, to sign up an actual author and then associate an AWS Cognito user with that author. So we're just going to do this manually for now. In a subsequent video, we'll look at customizing the Amplify sign-up process so that when you sign up, you can create a user and you can select the type of user, make that an author, and then create a new author object in the AppSync GraphQL service. It'll create an author in the Dynamo, in its associated DynamoDB table, if that makes sense. So what we're going to do is go into Cognito, and if you in episode 4 went through the process of setting up AWS Amplify Authentication and created a user, all your users should be here under the user pools. So you should be able to go in there and select your environment, and then from there you'll be able to see your users and groups, and click on the one you want and you'll be able to grab their user ID. So the user ID is the sub value. Copy the sub value, and you should be able to go back into your AppSync service, select run a query. So there's two things you can do. You can either create a new author and associate the user ID with the author. Alternatively, we could just update an existing author, and you would obviously need to pass the ID value of that author. So you would obtain this by perhaps just running another query here to list all the authors, similar to running that will give you a list of authors and IDs, and you can pick the one you want, pop it into here. Really, you just want to again associate the sub value. So now once you run that query, you will have a Cognito user associated with a author in your DynamoDB table. Okay, so let's create a section of the website that only an author should have access to. We'll start by creating a new folder within our components directory, which we shall call author. We shall create a new file to define our author type. And in here, we're going to define a type called author details, and this models precisely the author that we defined in our GraphQL schema with an ID, first name, last name, email, and the user ID attribute that we just added. We also create a stub, which will be an empty set of author details in the event that some data comes back invalid from our GraphQL service. Next, we will create a author query. This is where the juicy bit happens. So this page is where we're going to define our GraphQL query. You can see here that we're going to utilize the list authors query that's provided by our AppSync GraphQL service. We're going to pass in the logged in user ID. This should return an array of matching items. We're going to define a method to retrieve. We're going to define a method to run the query. If you want to find out what your logged in user ID is, you can just log the user ID to the console, and that will give you the user ID, the sub value that we talked about earlier as part of your Cognito, AWS Cognito user. I'll remove that for now. We're going to use the Reason Apollo hooks use query to run the query, and we're going to pass it that user ID value, which ultimately gets passed to the list authors query. The use query can return one of various states: loading, error, or no data, or the actual data. in either of these three instances, we're just going to return an empty array. If there is a valid array of user data, and really there should be one. We've seen this belt.option buckle script library in previous videos before. The response will contain list authors, which will be an optional. If there's some value, then we flat map that to get the actual items themselves. If they are valid items, we handle that, iterate through them, and really, again, there should be only one. So if it's valid, we return the item itself with all of the author details. If not, we just return a author stub that we defined earlier. And you'll notice that the JSON to string method here, we'll need to pop that up here. The AWS email object that we defined in our schema actually returns a JSON object. So we need to pass that, decode that, and convert it into a string. That's what's being expected by the author details type that we defined earlier. Now finally, we can create the actual page that will only be accessible to an author. And this is where we're actually going to use the query that we just defined. We open the query. We use our useUser hook that we've defined in previous episodes, and we handle a switch statement. So if it's a guest, that we will display that as being, that page as being 403 unauthorized. If the user is authenticated, we pass in the user details that we set up earlier in the video. And now we take the user ID, pass it into the getAuthorByUserID function that we just defined. We handle the result. So you'll remember that method returns an array. It can either be an empty array or it can be an array with really what should only have one item, which is the author details if it is successful. So we're going to pattern match the results of that array. We're going to say, well, if it's an empty array, display sorry, you're not an author. Or there's just nothing there, that's sort of a catch-all, again, sorry, you're not an author. If there is an author, then this is how we grab the first item in that array, and we pass that into, we display this section that again we've defined in previous videos, and we'll see a page just saying congratulations, you're an author. So let's try and run that, and let's see if it all works. So I'm on the home page. If I try to browse to author, it should be unauthorized. I'm not logged in. So let's log in. So you can see that this account has not been actually associated with an author. I can then go into my GraphQL service and run a mutation to that I showed you how to do earlier to associate this account with an author. So once I've done that, I should be able to refresh the page and be greeted with congratulations, Eugene, you're an author. And that's about it.
So I hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Stay tuned for the next one, where I'm going to show you how to create a mutation using Reason Apollo hooks. You'll want to have completed the previous episode, episode 6, where we set up a form. We're going to continue that form. We're going to take the user details that we created using the author query in this episode, going to pass them into the form. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And look, yeah, the usual drill. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you like and hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and hit the notification bell. And also I just want to say, a really heartfelt thank you to everyone that's messaged me privately and given me some feedback and some words of encouragement. I have a whole bunch of more of these videos prepped. So I hope to be bringing you a lot more of them. So I've also set up a Patreon page. If you did want to support me, if you are finding these videos helpful, that would be a great way to sort of encourage me to continue to produce them, and would help me a lot. So thanks again, and see you guys in the next one.